They say life changes in the most unexpected of places, and sometimes what begins as a simple dinner turns into a moment that rewrites destinies. Imagine this: a millionaire CEO, the kind of man everyone reads about in glossy magazines, the kind of figure who commands boardrooms and inspires fear in rivals, sits waiting in an upscale restaurant for a blind date. He is polished, confident, surrounded by an aura of success, the very picture of someone who supposedly has it all. Yet beneath the perfect tailored suit and expensive watch is a man who has grown weary of shallow conversations and relationships built on appearances. Across town, a woman nervously checks her reflection in the mirror before stepping out of a modest apartment she shares with her little son. She's not dressed in luxury brands, not carrying designer bags, not arriving in a chauffeured car. She's a single mom, balancing bills, responsibilities, and dreams too often put on hold for the sake of her child. When she enters the restaurant, her presence is quiet, almost unassuming. Yet something about her sincerity makes people pause without even realizing why. And when the CEO looks up and sees her for the first time, he expects the usual, perhaps another conversation filled with scripted charm. But he has no idea that tonight, this woman is going to shake the foundation of his world. Before we dive into this story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and join us for more powerful, emotional stories that remind us all of the unexpected beauty life can bring. The Millionaire CEO, Alexander Grant, was a man who had lived the last decade in the whirlwind of corporate empires and relentless competition. Every glance he received from people at the restaurant was one of recognition, some admiring, some envious, and some laced with that thinly veiled resentment reserved only for the successful. Yet when Elena, the single mom, stepped through the polished glass doors, there was a sudden shift in the air around his table. She wasn't dressed extravagantly, but there was a rare kind of quiet elegance about her that didn't rely on sequins or silk. Her navy dress was simple, and the small silver chain around her neck bore a locket that looked well worn, as if it carried more sentimental weight than monetary value. She moved carefully, not timidly, but with the poise of someone who had lived through struggles that demanded strength without showmanship. Alexander found himself unexpectedly rising from his chair, something he rarely did for anyone anymore. He had grown used to the dance of dates who paraded vanity, dropping names of luxury brands, flaunting connections, or worse, subtly hinting at what they hoped to gain from him. But Elena's first words disarmed him entirely. She smiled, not nervously but warmly, and said, "I hope I'm not too late. My son had a nightmare before I left, and I couldn't leave without making sure he felt safe." That single sentence shifted the entire energy of the evening. Alexander blinked, his mind briefly caught on the word son, realizing that this woman carried more than just her own world on her shoulders. For the first time in years, he listened with genuine curiosity instead of rehearsing polite responses. Elena sat across from him, unaware of the stares from nearby tables. Some people whispered, recognizing Alexander immediately, and assuming this woman was just another fleeting companion. But Elena didn't seem to notice or care. She unfolded the menu with the seriousness of someone who actually looked at the prices, not because she was ashamed, but because she understood the weight of every dollar. And Alexander noticed. For once, someone was not dazzled by his status, not leaning into his reputation, but simply existing in her own reality, inviting him into it quietly. When the waiter approached, she ordered modestly, and when Alexander asked if she wanted wine, she hesitated before softly saying, "Just water, thank you. I don't drink. I want to make sure I can always drive home safely if my son needs me." That honesty, that groundedness, caught Alexander off guard more than any bold move could as the evening unfolded. Their conversation was not filled with the usual grandstanding or shallow compliments. Instead, Elena spoke about her life, not dramatically, but truthfully, the kind of truth that sits heavy in the heart. She had once dreamed of becoming an architect, sketching houses on scraps of paper in between working double shifts. But when she found herself pregnant and alone after her fiancé abandoned her, she chose to put her dreams aside. Every brick of her life had been built on sacrifices. Every smile she wore for her son was crafted out of resilience. She talked about her struggles, not to impress him, but because she didn't know how to sugarcoat her reality. Alexander, in turn, found himself sharing pieces of his own life he rarely revealed. The loneliness that came with success, the parade of insincere relationships, the hollow victories that filled his penthouse but never touched his soul. And as he spoke, he realized Elena wasn't judging him, nor was she impressed. She simply listened. And that act, so small yet so rare, felt like the most valuable gift anyone had given him in years. At T1 point, Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying her as if trying to reconcile the paradox before him. She was nothing like the women he usually met in his circles, and yet she had a quiet strength that made boardroom titans look insignificant. And then something happened that truly left him speechless. The waiter returned with their meals, and as Elena prepared to eat, she suddenly paused, bowing her head for a brief moment of silent prayer. It was subtle, humble, and entirely unperformed. Alexander wasn't a particularly religious man, but the sincerity of that moment struck him deeply. Here was a woman who carried grace even in the simplest of gestures, a woman who hadn't come to impress him, but who couldn't help but reveal her character in every action. Alexander's chest tightened with an unfamiliar sensation, respect, admiration, and a strange, rising hope. It was as if this blind date wasn't a chance encounter at all, but a collision of two very different worlds that both desperately needed healing. The whispers in the restaurant grew louder, some mocking, some curious, but Alexander no longer heard them. His entire attention was on Elena, this single mother who had walked into his evening without fanfare, yet was quietly rewriting the definition of what mattered most in his life. He found himself wondering, not about her background, not about her status, but about her son, about the life she led when the world wasn't watching, about the sacrifices hidden in the lines of her hands. And that realization left him more unsettled than any hostile takeover ever had. The dinner began like any other. Soft music, the quiet clinking of glasses, the ambient murmur of conversations from other tables filling the background. He tried to steer the conversation toward business, the safe zone where he was always in control. He spoke of acquisitions, of how he had risen from a struggling young entrepreneur to owning companies across continents, and of how people admired him for his brilliance. She listened politely, her expression calm, but unlike the others he had sat across from, she didn't lean in with admiration or ask about his wealth. Instead, she asked something that struck him deeply. But do you ever feel lonely in all of that success? The question lingered, echoing in the silence that followed. He hadn't prepared for this. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not as a CEO, not as a man whose net worth was displayed on magazine covers, but as a person who might still carry emptiness despite everything. She shared stories of her life as a single mother, of late nights when her daughter was sick and there was no one else to lean on, of the odd job she had done to put food on the table, of how she found joy in the smallest victories. Her child's laughter, a roof over their heads, a warm meal earned through hard work. There was no bitterness in her words, no self-pity, just an honesty and strength that radiated far more than any luxury he had ever purchased. Something inside him began to shift. He found himself laughing more genuinely than he had in years, leaning forward not to impress, but to listen, hanging on to every detail of her story as though it carried the missing pieces of something he had been searching for. At one point, when the waiter poured more wine, he noticed her refusing politely, saying she needed to stay sharp for tomorrow morning because her daughter had a school project presentation she had promised to help with. That one sentence hit him harder than anything else. It wasn't just the sacrifices she made. It was the fact that she prioritized her daughter's happiness above all else, even in this moment when she could have chosen indulgence. That selflessness, that quiet strength, it left him speechless more than any boardroom negotiation ever had. He realized then that this was not just a blind date gone differently than expected. This was a revelation, an unveiling of something money could never buy. As the evening wore on, The conversation flowed more naturally than he could have ever expected, weaving between laughter, quiet reflection, and moments of unspoken connection. The millionaire CEO, a man so used to being in control of every exchange, now found himself captivated by the simplicity of her truths. He noticed things he usually overlooked: the way her hands moved when she spoke, the light in her eyes when she mentioned her daughter's dreams, and the small pauses where her strength seemed to carry unspoken battles he could only imagine. The weight of her resilience, her ability to navigate life's storms without complaint, stirred something unfamiliar within him. He found himself confessing parts of his own life he rarely shared, telling her about nights when success felt hollow, when the loneliness of empty penthouses and silent rooms pressed down on him, leaving him wondering if he had traded too much for power. She listened without judgment, nodding with an understanding that was both comforting and grounding, as though she had always known that money did not shield a man from sorrow. Then something unexpected happened. When the dessert was served, he instinctively offered her the more expensive option, a habit of showing his status through gestures of luxury. But she declined with a smile, choosing the simplest dish on the menu instead, saying, "Happiness isn't found in the price tag of what we eat, but in the company we share while eating it." That statement struck him harder than he cared to admit. He realized that all his life he had been chasing moments dressed in extravagance, while the essence of joy was something this woman had captured in her simplest of choices. The restaurant around them began to fade from his awareness. The clinking glasses, the polished marble floors, the whispers of waiters. It all dissolved into the background, as if the world had shrunk to just this table. Just her words, just the presence of a woman who carried no pretense yet commanded his full attention. He found himself asking questions about her daughter, about the way she balanced everything with such grace, about how she never let hardship harden her. Each answer felt like a doorway into a reality he had long forgotten. That strength was not measured in titles, cars, or properties, but in the everyday courage of someone who refused to give up, no matter how heavy life became. By the time the check arrived, he wasn't thinking of the usual calculation, what impression he had left, how she had viewed his wealth. Instead, he was thinking of her daughter's project the next morning, and wondering how he could fit into their world without disturbing its delicate balance, but rather adding to its light. He realized then that this meeting, this blind date, was not a coincidence. It was fate drawing two completely different lives together, testing him to see if he had the humility to recognize a real treasure when it stood before him. The night had grown late, yet neither of them seemed eager to leave. Outside, the city glowed with restless lights, a reflection of lives rushing in every direction. But inside, at their small corner of the restaurant, time seemed to have paused. He walked at her car, not the sleek machine he was used to stepping into, but a modest, slightly worn vehicle that carried the stories of school runs, grocery trips, and late-night emergencies. She apologized softly for its condition, but he only smiled, saying it was more beautiful than any luxury car he had ever seen, because it represented something he had never known, a life grounded in love, responsibility, and sacrifice. She laughed at his words, thinking he was teasing, but when she met his eyes, she realized he was utterly sincere. For the first time in years, he felt that his own achievements were dwarfed by the quiet heroism of a woman who carried the world on her shoulders without complaint. Standing there in the cool night air, he found himself hesitant to say goodbye. So he did something he had never done on a first date. He asked if he could meet her daughter. At first, she was caught off guard, protective and cautious, as any mother would be. But something about the raw honesty in his tone, the way he seemed less like a millionaire and more like a man stripped down to his truest self, made her nod. Days later, when he arrived at her small apartment, he was nervous in a way boardrooms and shareholders had never made him. And then her daughter ran into the room, her laughter filling the air, and the little girl wrapped her arms around her mother, looking up at him with curious eyes. In that moment, something inside him shifted forever. The board meetings, the contracts, the empire he had built, none of it compared to the warmth of that room, to the trust shining in those innocent eyes. As the evening unfolded, he sat with them, helping with homework, listening to stories, sharing in the small rituals that made their world whole. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a CEO, a man at the top of the corporate ladder. He felt like a man finally standing at the beginning of something real. And when he looked at the woman who had walked into his life on what was supposed to be just another blind date, he realized that she had given him the one thing all his money could never buy: belonging. Viewers, if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Grow for Justice for more powerful and emotional stories that remind us what truly matters in life.